today on behalf of EPIC Manitoba Career Week. You are going to be participating in Stephen C. Jones Youth Biolab. Stephen is from the St. Boniface Hospital Research area, and his presentation today is called COVID-19 and Beyond. Steve runs the Youth Biolab at St. Boniface Hospital, Albertson Research Center in Winnipeg. After starting out in a heart research lab at St. Boniface in 1999, Steve began doing full-time outreach work in 2005, laying the groundwork for opening the Youth Biolab at the Research Center in 2013. Since then, Biolab has welcomed over 30,000 students from across the province to experience hands-on biomedical science in their state-of-the-art facility. And I just want to say that is fantastic. Recently, Steve and his colleague Megan were involved in writing a magazine for youth called No Mercy for the Coronas, designed to help others understand the complicated science behind COVID-19 pandemic. Steve, thank you for being here today.
All right, my pleasure. Hi to everyone, wherever you are. I'm not sure who we've got and from where we've got and if you're in high school or where you're at, but what I thought I'd do today is just let you know a little bit about what we do and how I got to where I'm at and what goes on here at a research center. I'm going to assume that if you've tuned into this, maybe you have some interest in maybe medical science, maybe you have some interest in maybe you just saw the COVID-19 bit and thought I'll pop in and see what this is about. Maybe you're just kind of thinking, I'm not sure what I want to do as I move on from high school. And I'd like to give you a chance just to see a little bit about what we do and tell you a little bit about what we've done recently during the shutdown, which has kind of challenged me in my daily job to think about how do I change what I do, and that's a challenge for anyone doing work anywhere. So like I said, my name's Steve Jones. When this is not where I pictured myself being when we talk about careers and getting somewhere in life necessarily. When I came through high school, I was interested in science. I was interested in medicine. I also loved writing. I loved the arts, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. So, there's always this idea that there's all these jobs in science. So I went through high school. I went to university for a Bachelor of Science degree, just thinking I'll do something in science, and I never really knew what that was going to be. For me, medicine was kind of an option. Maybe some of you here are thinking, that's where I want to end up is in medicine. Really, where I'd like to take you today is if you're interested in healthcare, if you're interested in medicine, healthcare is much bigger than being a doctor or a nurse. And a lot of what we do here at the Research Center is part of that too. And so where I've ended up in my career and where a lot of the people who work in this building have ended up is a place where you're involved in healthcare, you're interested in healthcare, and there's many ways that you can contribute your skills to that greater picture of medical science, whether that's bedside stuff or whether it's lab stuff or whether it's interesting things like we do here in the lab behind me. So I thought what I'd do is just tell you, I'll run you through just to show you a few pictures, show you a little bit about what goes on here at St. Boniface Hospital Research, tell you how I got to where I'm at, and then we'll have a time for some questions. I've got the chat open in front of me too. If you want to throw anything in there, feel free. I'll keep my eye on that as we go. But let me show you a few pictures and stuff too. So you get a picture of what we do here. That's a big part of my job is sharing what happens in this building. If you've ever driven past, you all know St. Boniface Hospital, most likely, depending on where you're from. You might have been born here. You might have been here for any other reason. Obviously, a hospital's job is taking care of patients. hopefully treating people and, you know, helping people move on from whatever health problem has brought them into the hospital. At St. Boniface, we've got a couple of different research buildings here as well, and a lot of major what we'd call teaching hospitals have a similar setup. So I'm just going to pull up a couple of pictures for you so you can see what we do. Is this showing for everybody?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So this is just a picture of the St. Boniface Hospital campus here in Winnipeg. You can see the hospital up there in the top left corner with the cross on top. That's St. Boniface Hospital. Really one of Winnipeg's two major teaching hospitals. There's St. Boniface and Health Sciences Center. When we say teaching hospital, we're hospitals that are involved in training doctors and nurses. So we're highly affiliated with the universities and colleges. But also at Health Sciences and at St. B and a lot of the major teaching hospitals across Canada, we also have a pretty big research program going on. So in the forefront of this picture, you can see our two big research buildings. The Asper Institute is a clinical research building, and the Albrechtsen Research Center over here where I work is our basic science building. And just so I have a picture of how all this works, because these are things that I didn't know when I was in high school. When I think I'm going to go into science and be some sort of scientist, you know, there's a million places where you can do these things. Our research facilities are basically a partnership between the hospital, but most of our labs in our building here are University of Manitoba labs run by University of Manitoba professors, and a number of our labs are Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada labs. So we've got about 4 labs that are federal government labs that work with us here as well. When we say, you know, we do medical research, and the big idea of medical research is, you know, if you actually want to cure a disease sometime in the future, you have to understand it first. So when we look at medical research, we break it down into 2 main areas. Basically what we call basic medical science or basic medical research and clinical research. So you might have heard these terms before, you might not have. Often when I bring people into this building, I ask the same question. What is the difference between basic and clinical science? Basically the idea is basic medical research is everything we can do in the lab. So if you picture people working away in a lab, that's basic science. Clinical research is when we can move those things to the bedside, to actually testing on people, right? So it's this idea of lab work and human testing. Before we can ever test anything on a human, these things have to happen at the basic medical research side. And then the idea is this idea of bench to bedside. How do we take those things that we learn on the lab bench and get them into a patient someday down the road? And there's some feedback. It goes round and around and around and around. As we learn more, we keep pushing things forward. Okay? So basically this idea, fundamental disease and then human testing. So here at St. B, we kind of do both. We have a basic science area and we have a clinical science area. So we can cover all of these things and work together with other scientists, other physicians, and other doctors who do that clinical side. Okay? And this is really the basis of any medicine you ever are going to take. Has to start at the basic side, at the bench top. That's where we do a bunch of our learning. And it has to move then through clinical testing. So when we're hearing these things about developments of vaccines for COVID-19, we're pushing it really, really, really fast to try and get into that clinical stage where we can actually start testing these things on people. Normally, those things would take years and years and years and years. Here in our building, we have 3 main research outfits. You know, when you think of medical research, things that pop into people's heads all the time are cancer and infectious diseases. Here in our building, we don't do either of those. We kind of have 3 big things. We've got our Institute of Cardiovascular Sciences. So that's heart research. We have our Division of Neurodegenerative Disorders. They study neurodegenerative diseases, which are diseases that destroy neurons. So neuro means your neurons. Degenerative are diseases that break down nerve cells. So diabetes, Alzheimer's are both good examples of neurodegenerative disorders that we study here. And we have our Canadian Centre for Agri-Food Research in Health and Medicine, and their interest is foods, or what we call functional foods. So trying to understand what's in foods that could actually be healthy for us. So here at St. B, kind of 3 main research floors, one for brain, one for heart, and one mostly for foods in those basic sciences. When we look around the building, and we can talk lots about this in our question and answer part, but you know, at a research center, when we talk again about being a scientist, there's a lot more than just being someone who works at the lab bench. In this building, for example, we have 23 different labs. Every single lab is run by what we call a principal investigator, and for the most part, those are PhD scientists, so people who've gone all the way through the university. They've done a bachelor's degree, they've done a master's degree for another couple of years, they've done a PhD for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. They've went on for further training, and now they run their own research program. In each of those labs, you might have research associates, research assistants, postdoctoral fellows, and students. So if you came into our building and looked around, really that's who you'll see is master's students, PhD students. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who support what we do. We work with medical doctors and surgeons. We've got technicians and managers. We've got a huge media and communications team. We've got IT. We've got dietitians and nutritionists. You name it. There's so many people supporting the work that we do here, whether it's chemists or animal care specialists or people drawing blood over in our clinical areas. And just a little picture, you know, here's the people who work here. This is pretty typical cross-section of who works at a research center. It's old, it's young, it's guys, it's girls, it's people from all different backgrounds and really all around the world. It's really, if you come into it being curious, that's what it takes to work at a place like this. My job is a little different. So this is, I'll just show you a few pictures of what we do. So I run a lab called the Youth Bio Lab. So I started out in heart research here in one of our heart research labs upstairs, and eventually started to change my focus. I didn't really picture myself being at the bench top for the rest of my life. And we started to think about how can we share the things that we're interested in doing. And what we did was started going out into schools and seeing what teachers needed to know and how we could help teachers. And eventually we built this lab that you can see behind me and that you can see all these kids in the pictures of, where we're working together to help students, help youth in Manitoba learn about science here in Manitoba and science that goes on here in the research center. What else can I show you? That's probably about it for now. We can have a few questions. Let's see who's around. I'm going to jump back to the other screen. So a big part of the job we do here, like I say, is sharing all of the things that we do upstairs in ways that hopefully we can help students understand the science behind health. How do we actually try and understand what's going on inside the body to cause disease? At its most basic, what it comes down to is comparing healthy things to sick things. That's the main part of our job, whether that's healthy tissues and diseased tissues, healthy organs like a healthy heart to a diseased heart. How do they actually look different? How do they function differently? And if we can understand how they're different, then maybe we can start understanding how to approach these problems that we see in these cells, tissues, organs, and systems. Anyone have any questions at this point? I feel I'm just yakking, and if anyone wants to jump in with any questions about what we do, I see a few coming up on the side here. Even just to start, I see, you know, Ruth posted there, you know, was I a strong academic student in high school? I was pretty spread out in my interests. If any of you are high school students here, I don't know if you can wave or tell me you are. I mean, as a high school student, I was interested in a lot of things, and I was never sure exactly what I wanted to do as a job. It could have been writing. When I got out of, even in university, my thought was maybe I'll be a science journalist because I liked writing and I like science. I was lucky enough to fall into this job. Well, not fall into it. I had to work to get it, but it was what I say to students, and what my key to finding the work that I love is in science, the number one thing is curiosity. So whether you have the best marks is not always the most important thing. Being curious is the number one thing to be successful in science. And in any job, if you can show up and be curious and interested, that's the most important part. Did anyone have any questions as we start? I'll give you a second to throw them in the chat or shout them out if you're unmuted. Or. So, and I see Ruth posted there too. Like, I'm not a COVID-19 researcher, so I'll just get that one out of the way. We, in our building here, we actually don't study any infectious diseases. So when we talk about COVID-19, that's an infectious disease, meaning, you know, it's contagious. It's obviously contagious. It's something that that can pass from person to person. In Winnipeg here, we definitely have people who do study that. So you might be familiar with the medical microbiology laboratory on Arlington Street, or the virology lab, they call it. That's where the COVID-19 work is actually going on. My background's heart research, studying what happens to hearts after heart attacks. That's my background. But as someone who does the work that I do, sharing how we understand science, it's part of my job to understand how these work as well. And a lot of the techniques they'd use in COVID-19 research are techniques we use right here in our building and in our lab to study viruses and things like that. So Oscar asked there, just what does our schedule look like? And that's a really good question. Schedules in a lab, like if you're going to work in a lab, schedules can be all over the place. One of the big things when we work with disease, whether you're COVID-19, whether you're cancer, whether you're heart disease, we often work with cells in a dish. That's kind of where most basic research starts. I'm going to grab you a dish right now just to show you what I'm talking about. So we can take cells out of tissues and keep them alive in a little dish that looks like this. This could be heart cells. This could be cancer cells. This could be lung cells that you want to infect with something like coronavirus or test out different treatments. So when Oscar says, you know, what does our schedule look like? Oftentimes we have to rely on the schedule of the experiments that we're doing. So you'll see a lot of master's students and PhD students working all hours of the day, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but the job is let's learn as much as we can here. And sometimes that learning doesn't stop. And just Ruth kind of popped in on that. How do you stop your mind from just running about science all the time? That's part of just having a good work-life balance. And that's important whether you're, 43 like me, or whether you're in high school. That work-life balance, having other things to do is super, super, super important. Alina just asked, are there parts of our job that we find difficult? Absolutely. In science, in discovery, we don't know all the answers. And that's part of the fun of it, but that's also a big part of the challenge of the work that we do, is how do you cope with not knowing the answers all the time? How do you cope with failure? Science is not easy. If we knew all the answers, then there wouldn't be anything for us to do. So our job really is being prepared to, when something doesn't turn out the way you want in an experiment, trying to understand How do I change my perspective? How do I deal with things not working out? How do I learn something from something not going right? And really, if you don't fail, you don't learn, whether that's in an experiment or in life or anything else. So again, and I see Ruth popping in to say I see a question, how often is the lab cleansed? Around here, we've got to do a ton of cleaning, especially now. I think we're all familiar. We just got back into our lab actually this week. Our lab is what we call a level 2 facility. We do have some level 3 facilities. These might not be familiar terms to everyone. The virology lab on Arlington Street, that's a level 4 facility. That's where if you're working with a virus, you're wearing the full suit, the full containment, the oxygen, all that sort of stuff. Here in our lab, when you work with things that come from living things, whether it's cells from hearts or cells from brains or live animals, anything like that, cleanliness is super important because there is always a risk of disease transmission when you're working with tissues that come from a living thing. So cleaning is super important in anything that we do around here. I'll explain those levels really quickly so you get a picture of what we're talking about. In biohazards, there's 4 levels. There's level 1, which are things that have never caused a disease in people. So generally safe to work with out on the benchtop. You might probably want to wear some gloves and some goggles. Level 2 are things that maybe could cause disease in people. If we're working with human tissues, that gets a little more challenging. Level 3 is getting into infectious diseases like HIV, things like that. Level 4 takes us into Ebolas and things like that. So it's all these different levels of risk that we have to do. Oscar's just asking what's our best or worst experience in our workplace. My best is I'm really lucky. I've in my career path, I started in heart research, just being curious. I came in and met the professor who ran the lab I worked in upstairs. We got along just great. I expressed my interest in what they do and spent some years doing that. I ended up going back for an education degree along the way, thinking, I'm really interested in science, but I'm interested in the big picture of science. A lot of the work that we do at basic medical science in the heart research is really small pieces of this huge puzzle. So for me, those little teeny tiny parts, I realized that's not really what I'm interested in. And then that's years into working in that job. And sometimes you're just like, I like it, but I like the big picture. So I started looking at how do I get my experience to be matched up with what I'm really interested in. And I went back for an education degree thinking maybe I'll be a teacher. Maybe I can go do this as a teacher. And then I started thinking maybe there's a way that I can take all the things we do here at the research center and share them with others. And that's become a big part of my job now. They built this whole lab for us so that we can bring students who are, from grade 5 all the way up to grade 12. And we've taught some university in here as well. So we can show them all the things that we do. You can come in here and play around with live cells. You can come in here and we have kids in dissecting hearts and working with stem cells and all these sort of things that we hear about all the time. So best and worst, there's a lot of worst where things don't work out. There's a lot of best where, hey, every day I get to come in and work with curious kids. That's the best part. Recently, I'll say the best thing that's come out of the work that I do, and I'm going to share this with you on the screen. Recently, during the shutdown, I can't have kids in here. So we started thinking, what else can we do? And what we ended up doing was putting together this this magazine, and I'm going to share this with you on the screen. I'm not sure if all of you have seen this at this point. It came out in the newspaper a couple of weeks ago. And this is a magazine that we developed with La Liberté, which is the French language newspaper here in Manitoba, and Professor Jean-Éric Guillard here in, he's from the University of Manitoba in Department of Immunology. You can see him there. You can see me there. Megan works with me too. Megan's hand in hand. She's one of my partners here in the biolab. Also, Angelica works with me here to help us deliver the programming that we do. And this was just a really interesting part, again, that came out of being out there and being curious about science. These are all people who, well, Jean and Ick, very interested in science. And we came up with this idea, how do we share the things that we love about science with kids? And this got to challenge me. I've never written a kid's book before, but we were able to write a children's book together to start explaining some of the science behind our current situation and the COVID-19 pandemic, and even some of the biology behind how our body deals with things like this. So this is a really fun part of my job is, hey, I get to be creative. There is a big part, I'm just going to stop sharing there. There is a big part in science that we often don't talk about, is that creativity, is that it's not all about what you know. Science is really about what you don't know and how do we learn those new things. And you have to be creative to find the answers to some of those questions that we have and some of those problems that we have, whether it's healthcare, whether it's physics, whether it's social science, whether it's psychology. There's so many things out there for us to learn. And like I say, curiosity is where it starts, whether it's the hard sciences, the physical sciences, medical sciences, or social sciences. It's curiosity. How do you learn new things? And you have to be creative in that approach. So my advice always is, keep it open. Keep your interest open. It's the discovery is the fun part. Couple last questions I'll just hit. What high school did you go to? I actually grew up in Southern Ontario, so I went to a school in Guelph, Ontario. And my folks moved out here when I went to university. I stayed out and went to university, and I showed up in 1999 and just sent a resume off to this building. I know some of you have to go right now. I can stick around for a couple extra questions. If you do have to go, I'm moving on to another session. Thanks for joining us. I'll stick around for a little bit. Another question from Oscar, like, what kind of opportunities are available for young doctors? There's all kinds of opportunities for young doctors. If you're interested in medicine, there's so many different ways you can take that. The thing I always say to folks who are interested in medicine, being a doctor is something you really, really have to want to do. It's not an easy thing to do. If Oscar, I don't know what grade you're in right now, but you know, this is something that a lot of people start thinking about pretty early on. And if that's what you want to do in your future, spend some time in research too. That's actually a lot of people who end up in medicine are spending time in research. Any time in research to start learning that basic side that can help them in the clinical setting when they're actually helping treat patients down the road. And some of these things are very important, even when you're applying to med school, to show that you do have some interest in that holistic picture of medical science, all the way from the bench to the patient. If there's any other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I don't think I can hear any of you, but
Steve, can I?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't have the chat option. So I'm wondering if Alexis, who's had her hand up for quite some time.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't see that there actually either. So we're all learning together. Alexis.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Hi, so I was just wondering, so I go to a French school, and I was just wondering if there's different benefits of being bilingual.
Oh, that's an awesome question, Alexis. Actually, so Megan, who works with me, that's the whole reason she got her job. And like, just in our personal situation here, is she got her job because I was looking for someone who could speak French and do the science, which is actually really kind of, these are the challenges when you're in a highly specialized thing. There's a lot of language here that you might not know in French from immersion or from coming up through high school. So having that language background here, very, very, very important, especially at a hospital like St. Boniface. Like we are a bilingual institution. We try and offer everything in French and English. As a researcher, if you get into science, any second language is great. Any third language is great. Science goes around the world. And in our building here, there's probably 20 different languages spoken, at least, out of 250 people from all over the world. So French definitely in any career, I'd say, super important. Anyone else?
Just a question on my end. What do you think are like the ethical borders in your line of work?
That's an excellent question too. This is something we deal with all the time. Ethics is actually probably the most important part of what we do. In our line of work here and in any medical research, any new drug that is ever going to be exposed to the market, when I say drug, I mean medicine, has to be ethically tested all the way through. And that's starting in little dishes of cells that might come from a rat. It's animal work. We do have to work with animal models of disease for heart, for Alzheimer's, for diabetes. We can't just start testing things on people. Things have to start in animal models first. So when we talk about ethics, there's animal ethics. There's more rules on the use of animals in research than there is on anything else that goes on in this building. So when we want to perform experiments, this all has to go through multiple levels of approval. So we have a veterinarian on staff, and Randy's our vet. He's the guy who makes sure that everything we do is according to the law in Canada for ethical treatment. And especially when we start moving into humans in the clinical side, actually testing new medicines on people, there's a whole world of ethical considerations there. Everything needs to be safe, and everything needs to be shown to be effective. Okay, and the ethics involved in that are super important. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and just like a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
What do you think is like overlooked or misunderstood in your line of work, kind of?
That's a really good question too. When we talk about medical research, there's a lot of things that people don't understand, like even just the idea of how do you get a cure for something, or even if we look at our current situation, what does it actually take to get a safe and effective coronavirus vaccine out there? There's an enormous amount of work that goes into developing these things. You're basically going from thousands and thousands and thousands of ideas over years and years and years and years and years to narrow it down to one single, treatment or cure or medicine. And I think the biggest thing that people don't understand is the amount of work that goes into creating that one drug, that one medicine, that one vaccine, and the amount of people involved in that. It's no one scientist. The way I like to describe this all the time, it's one huge puzzle, and every lab, every graduate student, every student here has their tiny little piece of that puzzle. We can't cure the disease till that whole puzzle's filled in, but it's just tiny piece by tiny piece by tiny piece. The work is huge. There's so much to answer. There's so much to explore. And I don't think people realize the effort that goes into doing that one thing. So that's the one thing I'd say is overlooked or misunderstood. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Alexis has her hand up.
Sure. I can't see if people have their hand up, so
I'll tell you. I can see
sure.
that, but I can't see chat.
Okay.
So then, like, what would you say would be the best path, like right out of high school? Like, what would you say would be the best path if you're wanting to go into like medical research?
So the best path is always, so a bachelor, go do a Bachelor of Science degree at a university is kind of your typical path. People have different interests and different ways to get there. Even looking around at the people who work here, most of them have a university degree, a bachelor's degree. Most of them are working on graduate degrees, on those master's level after your bachelor's, PhD after that. But there's also a lot of people here who are interested in the technical side of things. So actually like just loving the lab work, like the benchtop stuff, you can also go to Red River at a college level and do a technical degree or a technical diploma for a couple of years where you really learn how to work the machines, how to do the stuff, which would be more of a technician kind of job. And those people would be staff of the lab, right? So in each lab, you'd have the PI, the principal investigator, who's a PhD scientist. They run the lab. They get to come up with the big goal for that lab. What is what is our hypothesis? What are we chasing? What part of the puzzle is ours? With that lab, you're going to have a bunch of students. So these are master's students and PhD students. They all have their own little projects, their own parts of that puzzle. And then you'll also have a bunch of staff. These are paid people who work in the lab. Like that's where I started out, was just a lab technician, whose job is to help all those experiments run smoothly and understand how to do all the stuff. Maybe not come up with all the big ideas and hypotheses, but to really work the stuff. So there's a bunch of different approaches you can take. My advice to anyone thinking about medical research and is really, when you go into university, when you're thinking about that future, any combination of talents is very desirable to a lot of people. So if you're interested in computer programming and science, find a way to combine those two things in your future. There's going to be a ton of work in and interesting jobs. If you can program, if you're interested in what we call bioinformatics, like how do we combine computer science and basic science? Really, really, really important as we're getting into AI applications. That's going to change research a ton in the next, 5, 10, 15 years. We're already seeing these things start to creep into that research environment. So any combination of kind of two interesting things, that's how I ended up in the job I'm at, is that I took my interest and love in science and my background in science and my interest in education, and I was able to kind of spin those two into something that I get to do every day. It's not always easy. Like in our occupation here, we're responsible for finding the money to do all these things too. So, that's a hard thing to do too. But again, if you have a nice background in writing, the best people at finding the money are the people who are great writers as well. There's a huge communication piece to science that we always kind of forget about. So I'm always an advocate of bringing a bunch of things all together, okay? And keep your brain open, keep your mind open to how do I tie the things that I'm interested in together in one thing. So, typical path, follow a Bachelor of Science, go to university, get a Bachelor of Science. You're going to learn a ton. If you're really interested in a career in medical science, how do you bring in some of the other things, especially IT and computer science stuff? Anybody else? Follow-ups?
I have one again.
Sure.
I was just wondering, based on the recent things that have been going around on media, saying stuff like coronavirus, how to ease your symptoms, or get rid of coronavirus, or just help me get rid of coronavirus. You as yourself as a perspective as a researcher, what do you think of these things, and what do you think is being selectively heard, and how they got these sources of information?
Well, this is the key to my job, is helping people understand how science really works. When we hear all these things about this will cure coronavirus and this will cure coronavirus and this is this, you have to look to the actual evidence. And as you train in science, as you learn these things in university or working in a lab, these are things that we go to look at the actual data that's out there. And these are hard things for folks your age to read necessarily. Sometimes they're hard for me to read too, if it's not my area of expertise, but to go to what people have actually published and studied and actually done the statistics on to be able to say, this is a true effect. We aren't there for coronavirus yet. It's starting to trickle out in the last few months as we're starting to understand this. But a big part of it is you have to look at the data. What we do know for sure is, right, washing, like this is evidence-based, is washing your hands, keeping your distance is going to reduce your chances of catching this virus. And you know, we've done pretty good at getting that message out, I think. But right now, there's no evidence showing any other, you know, magic cure for these things. These things take years and years and years and years to develop. We'll be lucky if when we get this a vaccine, we'll be very, very lucky to have that. But we aren't sure how long this is going to take. And these are huge challenges that tons of people are looking at right now. But again, it's going back to the evidence, and it's reading and learning how to understand the correct sources and what sources you can rely on. Does that answer?
Yeah, it answers a lot. Thank you.
Wash your hands. Anyone else?
Alexis, did you have a question?
Nope, I'm all good.
Okay. Anyone else?
And I'll, I'm not too hard to get in touch with. If you're interested, if you're thinking about things, youthbiolab.ca or sbrc.ca for St. Boniface Research Center, Youth Biolab. I'm pretty easy to find there if you're interested. If you got questions, if you need to follow up, feel free. sjones@sbrc.ca is my email address, sjones@sbrc.ca. You know, science is a big, huge, exciting thing. It can be frustrating a lot of times too. But like I say, it comes down to curiosity, asking questions. That's how I got here, was showing up, being interested. I didn't know anything about heart research when I walked in the lab, or when I walked in the door here, 20 years ago. But being curious and wanting to learn, that's what's going to be successful for you no matter where you go. Don't be afraid to walk up to your professors in university and ask them some questions, and show some interest in the work that they do. That's how you make these connections. That's how you find out what you're really interested in. Talking to people and seeing what they are interested in. I could carry on for hours and hours and hours about why I like heart research and why I think it's important. But it's just be enthusiastic about learning. That's what's going to take you the furthest in any job. So thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. If there's no more questions, I think we can sign off. Anyone else?
Oh. I just want to thank Steve for coming out this afternoon and sharing the great information. And again, Steve, how do students get in touch with you if they want to join the Youth Biolab? So write it down. You can get in touch with me, sjones, SJONES, at SBRC, that's St. Boniface Research Center, .ca. Our website is youthbiolab.ca. Same on Twitter. On Twitter, great. Well, thank you very much, Steve. My pleasure. Thanks for joining, everybody. Good luck out there. Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.